I've done that like a million times, so you'd think that it would just be totally second nature and appear as it's supposed to. But as we continue on, a few announcements before we get started today. We have upcoming talks in our series. I apologize for the formatting on this page. However, um, I I've asked that Katarina put in the chat the positioning theory virtual talks, the link to the Google Doc. There are some important upcoming talks. We have Thursday, February 13th. We have a talk on positioning theory in the context of intergroup peace and conflict, a very timely talk from Suslio Wibisano and Winifred Lewis, the University of Queensland. This is based on a chapter in the Handbook of Positioning Theory, and another talk on agency and multimodality use, investigating positions of English as foreign language teachers and teacher education by Driessen. And those two talks will be on February 13th. There's also a special engagement. This is a more recent edition that we added at the end of the fall semester, where Ali Moghadam has agreed to talk about democracy, diversity, and the appeal of authoritarianism and the omniculturalism solution. Another very timely talk for the times that we live in and events that we're seeing around the world. If you go to the Google Doc for the signups where all the registrations are, there's also a link to some of Ali's books that he's published on this topic. He has been churning out what looks to be a volume a week over the last few years on this really prolific work. And obviously, as one of the initial founders of positioning theory and working with Ram Hare, Ali's work has also been really important in this area and is extremely timely. And also, we have talks coming up on March 13th. Daniel Blix from Stockholm University will be talking about Swedish high school students' narrated experiences of reading as a practice. Talk 2 is a small stories approach to sex workers' identities in advocational posts on social media by Christos Seguros of King's College London. And Daniel and Christos are also leading a group of folks who are meeting together to do data analysis. And I didn't ask you in advance, Daniel, if you wanted to make any announcements about this, but if you want to say anything, feel free to unmute and put a little plug in here for the group. If you have anything you want to put in the chat, you could do that too. But do you want to say anything about the group that you have also going for analysis?
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Yeah, it's a small stories data sessions that we've been initiating since perhaps 3 seminars so far, me and Christos and Laura from King's College. Yeah, pure data analysis, you share data and we together have a small stories approach. And you know that positioning theory is pretty much in the core of the small story. So yeah, I could add something in the chat if you wanna read more and if you want to register. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, and you can certainly reach out to Daniel, or if you need Daniel's contact, if you put that in the chat. And also, I think a number of us know how to get in touch with you about that, but we're also happy to push out more information. So keep that in mind. And just a reminder, the Positioning Theory Handbook is out, and the ebook copies are available at a much lower price than the hardback copies, and you can get those online through Routledge or through other vendors. So the first talk that we'll do today is toward integrative methodology frameworks of positioning theory, social semiotics, and multimodality. Katarina Silvestri is here from the SUNY Cortland University, and I'm also a co-author on this chapter from the handbook. Katarina is suffering from COVID today, but she has graciously agreed to be here anyway. And so I know she's running not 100%, but we're really pleased that you're here, Katarina. Our second talk is Uncovering Power Dynamics and Mentoring Dyads Through Understanding Structural Moral Orders, a single case study. And this is being presented by Hannelore van der Kloot. And Hannelore, I had the pleasure to meet and work with this fall as she came to the University of Buffalo and is doing really wonderful work also with colleagues in the Netherlands, Erik Driessen and Eline Vanassche. So we'll also welcome Hannelore and your presentation today. And I'm going to stop sharing here and let Katarina pull up her slides. As always, the presenters are welcome to further introduce themselves, but we typically don't do formal bios just because that takes more time. So Katarina, whenever you're ready.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for bearing with my low voice today. I'm going to try to project the best that I can. As Mary said, my name is Katarina Silvestri, and I'm at State University in New York, Cortland, and we'll go from there. So this book chapter details emerging methodologies of what we're terming and what others have termed multimodal positioning analysis, integrating critically oriented positioning theory with a social semiotic perspective of multimodality to examine analytical tools that interrogate power as it manifests in contextualized discursive practices like speech and other acts. This work reflects a literature review and a methodological chapter in the Routledge International Handbook of Positioning Theory, and also what future steps we hope that scholars will engage with when using these methods in more critical work. And I just noticed that I'm frozen on my screen. Can you still hear and see me?
You're coming through good to me.
Okay.
Is Katarina coming through okay for others?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. I'm seeing some nods and thumbs up. So we'll continue and I'll turn it over to Mary.
I won't go through the positioning theory background of this because I think folks in this group are very familiar with this, but obviously in thinking about, let's see, I think, Katarina, can you move your bar on your, I think it's showing up on the screen, at least I'm seeing it.
Yeah, I'm trying. It's everything
Okay.
is, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
if it's not workable, I don't think it's that big a deal. We'll just big of deal. We'll just leave it there. So I think folks are familiar with positioning theory, so we won't go through that whole overview, but just keeping in mind that we feel that with approaches to social semiotics and multimodality, there are ways that we can use those intersecting with positioning theory to look at speech and other acts, position, storyline, as well as rights and duties and identities. And what you see on the screen is some of the positioning triangle or the adaptation from Slocum Bradley. And you can go to the next slide, Katarina. Also, ways of thinking about that, just a reminder that in thinking about these, Hooray and others have talked about that part of positioning theory isn't that this is just particular moments in time, but that these moments capture future, past, present, all in one, and what Luc van Langenhove has talked about as moral fields. And that's also helpful in thinking about the ways that these events get contextualized and also are connected through lots of modalities in and across time. So part of what we've tried to do in the chapter is to lay out some of the methodological approaches to social semiotics and multimodality. And obviously, there's a lot of work that's been written that other folks can go to and draw upon, but we've tried to build a little bit on the work of Carrie Jewett in the Handbook of Multimodality, and then connect that to aspects that we're looking at in the chapter. Katarina, the slides just disappeared. I don't know if you disappeared as well. I think maybe
I
Katarina
did as well. So
did she just disappear? So this is kind of a key moment because I need to talk about the three different systems of multimodality and multimodal analysis, which is on that slide. And I don't have a copy of the slides right present, but let me see if I can, I'm pretty sure, okay, Katarina says I lost the audio. Okay, hold on one second. Just bear with me while we work through these technical difficulties.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Katerina. I see the slides are back. I just pulled up my copy too, so if this happens again, I now have that open. Okay, so continuing along, as I said, we have part of what we lay out are that there are at least three different camps of folks who've looked at multimodality and social semiotics. There are more than this, so, but these are identified. We took Jewett's identifications and then adapted them to talk about how there are different perspectives on social semiotic multimodality. So the work of Halliday, Hodges, Kress, and Van Leeuwen, and that work we refer to as social semiotic multimodality. And then multimodal interactional analysis, which includes the work of Skolin and Skolin, Norris, also Kress and Van Leeuwen. And this looks at the importance of interactions taken at a micro level, contextualized within the context of macro level. So each of these different perspectives has foregrounds different aspects. So social semiotic multimodality, that top area is really foregrounding the importance of the sign maker, the orchestration of multimodal ensembles as a social process. And I should back up just a little bit and say, if anybody is really new to this construct of multimodality, multimodality really means just the use of multiple sign systems for making meaning. So examples of that might be one way of communicating with others is through speech, but also as we're speaking to others, we layer on other types of sign systems, which could include gestures or our body posture, for example. So someone might respond to you if someone asks the question, "Do you agree?" They might say, "Yes, of course I agree." But their body posture or gestures might say that they aren't agreeing, right? Or the tone of the voice, prosody. There are also lots of folks who look at multimodality in digital spaces, looking at the use of image with words, with movement or animation, what I've typically referred to as digital gestures in certain types of spaces. So if you're new to multimodality, it really means looking across all of those sign systems. And there's work that a lot of folks have done to look at this in different ways. That last circle on the left bottom side is multimodal discourse analysis and systemic functional multimodal discourse analysis. So this is the work of Halliday, O'Toole, O'Halloran, Unsworth, and others, and focuses on the importance of semiotic multifunctions in a system. So representational or ideational, the modal or interpersonal, compositional, textual, and constituent elements organized by size and rank. And we don't have time to go through and pull out each of these today to further explain them in detail. But if you're interested in multimodal analysis and research, the chapter further develops some of those connections and points you towards other things that you can read, as well as connections to positioning theory. And Katarina is going to talk more about those now.
Okay. So the way that we began this project was really to just see what was out there from a theoretical and methodological standpoint, where multimodality, and we do mean a social semiotic perspective of multimodality. When I say multimodality, that's what I mean. There are other perspectives out there. And then how the authors are integrating that with positioning theory, either theoretically, methodologically, or both. So I started in the education source and Erik databases, using terms of multimodal with the asterisk to catch as a catch-all for several different variations of that word. Positioning theory and quotations to try to capture that term on its own, as well as positioning. Positioning can often be used with positioning theory, or simply as a verb that they're seeking to use, and they're not using positioning theory at all. So we wanted to be very thorough in that. We wanted to review manuscripts that documented empirical research that applied positioning theory and multimodality in some way within the theoretical framework, methodology, or both. After limiting for this, as well as for peer-reviewed publications, while also removing duplicates, we found 18 studies for review that met this established criteria. And we studied how these theories, namely social semiotic perspective of multimodality and positioning theory, may be used together theoretically and methodologically. When we first reviewed the literature, we noticed several overarching themes, and obviously the chapter comments on these much more in depth. Well, first and foremost, we noticed that the main argument of proponents of multimodal perspective and its methods in conjunction with positioning theory is that only looking at the linguistic modalities alone, such as speech or the written word, print, cannot be sufficient for studying positions. Only looking at language leaves a lot of the story untold. And that positioning analysis is ultimately more robust when multimodal data analysis is also included, especially when considering matters of power. Many of these studies contended in one way or another how gesture, body positioning, eye gaze, and other embodied modalities can reveal positionings or repositionings, as well as reveal power or lack thereof within storylines. Now, identity and agency are also bound up with positioning as conveyed multimodally. And this really exemplifies the importance of Slocum-Bradley's expansion of the positioning triangle into the positioning diamond, and the work that has been done to expand even further than that. Often, multiple modalities can reveal elements of identity and agency through multimodal text production, or the larger social reproduction of inequities seen in classrooms through modalities like sound. And then finally, there were several studies that used positioning theory and multimodality and their affordances as analytical tools to study positions in digital spaces, including the phenomena of collective identity on social media, as well as multimodal practices of othering in digital spaces. One of the things that arguments that our chapter makes in this area is that digital spaces are fertile ground for analyzing positions multimodally, because they're the internet, social media spaces, that sort of thing, just are such a rich space for multimodal, composition and multimodal interaction to take place pretty typically because of images, like Mary mentioned, animation, moving pictures. I like the digital gestures and so on, along with speech. Now, there are going to be 4 studies that I'm going to show that intentionally reveal a sort of integration of positioning theory analytically with multimodal methodologies. This is what we would term multimodal positioning analysis. And so I'm going to share a snapshot of each of these analytical methods from these 4 studies. And obviously, these 4 studies are more they're shared more in depth in the chapter as well. So first, we're going to talk about Lonergan and their colleagues, showing a methodological framework for studying emotions using multimodal positioning analysis. Here, positioning theory combines with theories of emotions to create new constructs, as well as emotionally laden constructs that map onto positioning theory, like emotion acts, emotional labels, emotional storylines, emotional positions, and emotional moral orders. And a final layer of analysis reveals a multimodal analysis of student gestures, facial expressions, sound patterns, in addition to speech. And that's shown in the transcription method excerpted here. Particularly salient, we feel, are the drawings that go beyond the written word in transcript, truly bringing the spirit of multimodality into the analytical process. And that's something that I know that Mary and I and others who do multimodal work have talked about a lot. There's a very persistent tension when it comes to publishing multimodal transcripts or even excerpts of transcripts, because they become so long. Because if you are really, as you can see here, if you're bringing that spirit of multimodality into it, you're not simply relying on language alone to convey what you analyzed. And because so much of research, especially qualitative research, so much of our trustworthiness is in the disclosure of our, transcripts or excerpts of them, it can be really challenging when there are tight constraints on journal manuscript requirements to be able to even publish these. And again, that's a tension in the field that we hope, we can be innovative and, resolve a little bit. But Lonergan and colleagues have certainly demonstrated that here with their line drawings. Moving on, we have here our methodological framework for analyzing multiple facets of positioning using multimodal communicative data. Now, this methodological paper used data from an elementary-aged engineering club to construct and test an analytical tool that is pictured here. And this drew on the work of Slocum Bradley and intentionally merged this with theoretical understandings of multimodal communication to support microanalysis of multimodal data sets for social forces, storylines, identities, as well as rights and duties. And this slide shows how this tool highlighted different modes, like speech and action, to support researchers' note-making and analysis of this particular episode. And that's what you can see here. And I've highlighted that part where you can see that we have the speech as well as the actions that are kind of narrated there. And really, this was just illustrating the use and testing the use of this analytical tool. Moving on, now I'll highlight our work showing a methodological framework for multimodal positioning analysis, unfolding across multiple modalities as well as artifacts and interaction. Now, this is definitely a different way of presenting one's analysis. And it was a very interesting process where instead of giving analytical primacy to the people, the children in this group, we actually foregrounded the artifact first. And we looked at what happened to the artifact, turning down the sound, and just looked at what was done to the artifact as it was constructed by a group of students rather than foregrounding speech. And we did eventually bring speech into it, and we did several rounds of analysis. But when we we really foregrounded the artifact, we found that it generated 2 more varieties of self-other positions as they unfolded in interaction with this artifact. Individuals' interactions with the artifacts and their group members were salient in fully describing group dynamics, yielding new self-other positions with the artifact as it unfolds as a primary interactant in a small group, especially with what it means to be aligned with the artifact, or what it means to be aligned with the group and how that relates to power and group dynamics. And it was really interesting, the different modalities and gestures that really told so much of the story that words alone simply would not have caught, all of those different exchanges of power. Finally, we have Weisselman et al. This is a study that shows multiple layers of analysis and associated transcription methods. This demonstrates the purposeful integration and analysis of positions and storylines to illuminate power within social interactions, specifically as they relate to gender in the small student groups. The first layer of analysis required the use of microethnographic methods to develop individual and group storylines in conjunction with the activity system. Then the second layer comes in with critical discourse analysis to discern elements of power positioning. And then the final layer shown here, because it integrates very intentionally multimodality and positioning theory, you can see that there is a multimodal discourse analysis that illuminates gendered power dynamics within these social interactions. You can see here that there is spoken discourse, but also kinesics and proxemics for each student too, which really just looks at like bodily movement and gesture. And I'll turn over the last part to Mary.
So one of the things that we were thinking about as we wrote this chapter and also have revisited it since is thinking about critical multimodal positioning analysis, and that we feel that that notion of a critical multimodal positioning analysis across these studies that we pulled out that Katarina has just given you a little bit of an introduction to today, that each key study shows a purposeful, intentional, theoretical, analytical integration between a social semiotic perspective of multimodality and positioning theory. So positioning theory is acting as a dialectical scaffold. So there's a lot of extending, elaborating, perhaps pushing back or trying to address the theory and engage with that theory dialogically, not just as some sort of template or as we often see in studies, positioning theory will show up kind of at the beginning and then be used generally and disappear. In these studies, it's used throughout as an analytical framework as well, but also in terms of interpreting data. Each of these studies provided a clear illustration of their methodology in the text of their research. So in that way, we feel they're very helpful to scholars who want to look at examples of how this work can be done. And as we know, oftentimes the methods sections especially for qualitative work can be quite truncated. They're often shorter than what we would like to see, but at least there's some of that coming through with these. Interestingly, also, these studies address matters of power through intentional analysis of positioning and associated storylines instantiated through multiple modalities in this work. And those are all themes as well that we see across a lot of the work that folks are doing with positioning. And so this may be useful to other folks who are thinking about critical multimodal positioning analysis in different contexts and disciplines. Okay. And
sorry, I didn't have a fancy thank you slide. I apologize about that. Thank you.
That's okay. I wasn't sure if we had another slide after that or not. So I think that brings us to the end of our time. That gives you a very brief overview of what exists in this chapter, but also points to some things that might be useful if you are particularly interested in this work. If you're new to our structure here, what we do in our talk series is we do talk 1, and then we proceed immediately to talk 2. And at the end of this, we take questions and discussion across both of the presentations. So we're going to turn things over to Hannelore so that she can get started with her presentation. So Hannelore, I am seeing on my screen the slide that has a picture of the positioning theory handbook cover. If that's where you're intending to start, then things are working as they should be. So I'm going to turn things over to you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'm very honored for the invitation to present one of our studies that is about the power of students, and where we try to use positioning theory together with frame analysis to explore power dynamics in mentoring relationships. But before I dive into that study, I just want to give a little bit of background because this study is situated in my PhD, where I'm supervised by Professor Erik Driessen and Professor Eline Vanassche, who is also present today. And we try to uncover or understand a very important topic in mentoring relationships, namely power, by conducting an ethnographic case study in 2 disciplines. So in multiple cases, in medical education and in teacher education. And as I said before, we try to uncover the power by using an integration of positioning theory and frame analysis. And why do we focus on power? Because despite the benefits of mentoring, there are a lot of benefits that are also largely discussed in literature. Mentoring is also causing a lot of harm for students, and this harm can be very extreme, such as big conflicts or bullying behavior or harassment, but most of the times those are very subtle tensions or conflicts that are leading to disappointment or lack of motivation or missed learning opportunities for students. And one of the underlying reasons is power. And if we think about power, or if we read about power, most of the times we think about the mentor and the power imbalance between the mentor and the student. And also in literature, it's most of the time it's about hierarchy. And it's true that this power imbalance is causing a lot of harm or incidents in their relationships. But nevertheless, we believe that this perspective also potentially overestimates the responsibilities of the mentor, and maybe underestimates the responsibilities that students can have in the mentoring relationship, especially in the more subtle cases of tensions in the mentoring relationship. Because students themselves, they have expectations, they have beliefs and their own goals, and they act upon those beliefs and those expectations. So they are also influencing how the mentoring relationship is evolving and also influencing the mentor. For example, if a student does not put any effort in the internship, it also influences how the mentoring relationship is going, and also what the learning outcomes will be. So in this study, we want to see how the students are participating in those power dynamics. And especially the focus on how, if they do it, how do they do it then? But if power is not only hierarchy, what is power then? It's a very difficult question, which I will not be able to answer fully, but I'll try to give you an understanding what we mean by power. And first of all, we don't see power as something that is possessed or owned by one actor. So in this case, the mentor. We see power more as defaced, as Hayward calls it. That is, it's not connected to to one person or a characteristic of one person, but it is happening in interaction. You can only have power if you have an interaction with at least two people. So what Foucault is saying, it's in a continuous flux. It is continuously evolving, and it is achieved in and through discourse. So by the language we are using, nonverbal language, as well as the multimodalities, as discussed earlier, are influencing how power is evolving. And that's why we also have a focus on the power dynamics to highlight the dynamic interactual character. And we try to operationalize that discursive perspective of power by constructing a framework that is based on an integration of positioning theory together with frame analysis to try to conceptualize the power dynamics and also to try to analyze data. And this conceptual analytical framework is built on earlier work of my supervisor, Eline Vanassche, together with my former colleague, Steven Bruneel. As they stated that both start from that discursive perspective, which is also discussed in the chapter of government and positioning in the handbook. And specifically for this study, as you know, positioning theory looks at how mentors and students are positioning themselves and each other based on assigning and denying rights and duties. So these positioning processes can be like a translation of how mentors and students are participating in those power dynamics. But we added frame analysis to give extra meaning to what those positioning processes can mean for power. Frame analysis contains, in our understanding, expectations and goals towards the mentoring relationship and towards the internship, and therefore they give an extra meaning. So for example, if a mentor in medical education denies the rights to the student for him to participate in patient care, it can have two different meanings. For example, the mentor is framing the internship as, or the student is not ready to do his own consultation. So it's a different power dynamic than, for example, the student asked to observe and to not participate himself. Then the power dynamic is different. So based on this framework, we collected data. We did a multiple case study, in this case only in medical education, where we observed 4 mentoring Dyads in general practice. And the observations were during the internships of 6 weeks. So we observed the consultations, the home visits, lunch breaks, feedback conversations. And in those observations, we focused on how they were positioning themselves and each other. And then we did additional interviews in the beginning, in the middle, and at the end of the internship, first to have a discussion of the first interpretations of the observations, but also to gain more insight in their frames or their expectations and goals towards the mentoring relationship and the internship. And then first we had a familiarization of the data, and then we tried to identify episodes where we had the feeling that students were participating in the power dynamics. And these episodes were analyzed based on the positioning processes and the frames. And then there was a cross-case analysis, which was an iterative process of trying to make sense of those episodes and constructing types of power. And these types of power are presented here. So we found 4 types of power that students can participate in the power dynamics, and these are situated on 2 axes. So first we have the vertical one, which divides the doing power or students positioning themselves versus being enabled to do power, so being positioned by the mentor. This also highlights the discursive part because it's doing power and not owning or having power. And then there is the other axis that is about frames, whether they align or mismatch. And now, sorry, yeah. So these four types look very static, which is a bit in contrast with what I was saying about the dynamical character. But in fact, these types are continuously changing. So one type can be present for like 5 seconds and then change again. In every dyad, every type is present. And in the results, I will focus on only one case to give you insight that the types are indeed changing and how the frames and positioning processes are also changing or evolving during the mentoring relationship. So the first type is called resistance. And it's when students position themselves in a power position. So they're assigning themselves rights and duties that are aligned with their personal expectations and goals or their own frame. And this frame is mismatching with the frame of the mentor. So for example, I need to read. After a visit to a patient in a retirement home, the mentor consults with the nurse from the retirement home about policy for the patient. The student stands aside, says nothing, and looks at his cell phone. So by looking at his cell phone, he's kind of positioning himself outside of the conversation. And this is aligned with his frame, because in the first interview, he says that the only annoying thing about this internship compared to the previous one is that it contains a lot of home visits, so you don't have much opportunities to really work clinically or think or reason and actually have a normal consultation. So his act of putting his cell phone is aligned with what he's thinking about home visits in the retirement homes. And the next quote is from the mentor in the second interview. And he says, for example, in the car or even when we have to do a home visit, it's noticeable that Victor is very busy with his phone. I'd prefer he didn't do that, but then I think maybe it's important to him. I'm not going to say anything about it. So this frame is showing that the mentor is not aware of the frame of the student, but it's also not aligned. He doesn't like him to be on his phone. So there is mismatch, but it's also not aware of why the student is doing that. Then the second type of power is imposed power. Here the frames again are mismatching, but now the students are unable to do power. So the mentors are putting the student in a power position. And this example follows directly on the previous one, because after taking his cell phone, the mentor asks the student at the next home visit, are you going to take charge during the consultation? And the student hesitantly answers, yes. And he leads the home visit. And as you can see, this is the direction of the mentor. So it becomes clear that he has actually good intentions to try to activate the student, but it also shows that he's not aware of the student's frame, of the expectations of the student, because he thinks he's supporting the student by letting him do the consultation, but the student doesn't want to do the home visits. So instead of encouraging him, he's actually imposing power upon the students. And this is in contrast with the third type of power, which is empowerment. This is, again, when mentors are putting students in a power position or enable students to do power. But in this case, there is a frame alignment. So in this case, it's not imposed, but it's a kind of supported and encouraged kind of power. And for example, on the first observation day, 2 patients arrive at the same time, and the mentor asks the student which patient, and more specifically, which case he wants to treat. And the student chooses a patient with pain in his shoulder because it is the easiest one. And the student, this is an interesting case, I think, because as you can see now, the frame of thinking and reasoning clinically is not the most important one anymore, because he chooses the easiest consultation. So he doesn't learn how to reason clinically because it's not more difficult. But in an interview, he stated that, I think that by the end of this internship, I just want to have the confidence that I can welcome a patient in and send them away with a positive feeling. So this quote shows that frames can change and evolve. And in this case, the frame is about building confidence. And the mentor is supporting that frame. It also shows that even when frames align, it's maybe not the most desirable for learning, because it is the easiest consultation and not the most productive one to learn more. And then we have the final type of power, which is vested power, and I will explain it through a final example. On the 4th observation day, the first consultation starts at 8 in the morning, and the student has not arrived yet. So the mentor starts ahead, and a few minutes later, the student arrives, enters the consultation room, to which the mentor comments, "Oh, you didn't sleep well," because he looks a bit tired. And the student smiles but does not answer, and goes directly to the patient to draw blood, because the consultation is already happening. And the mentor asks if the student will draw blood because it is so soon, and the student nods in agreement, and then the student does it, takes a seat in the main chair afterwards to continue the consultation, and meanwhile, the mentor fetches an extra stool and places himself on the stool next to the student. So I think this case or this example shows that again, the frame of working on clinical skills is activated, and the mentor is supporting that skill. So the student is positioning themselves and himself, and the frames align. It also shows that by supporting the student, the mentor is also a bit backgrounding his own frame of expecting the student to be engaged, to be on time. So it is a kind of power where students get a little bit disconnected from the mentor, but they support it anyway. So these were the 4 types of power: so resistant, imposed power, empowerment, and vested power. And what do we learn from those findings? First of all, I think that these findings show that students are not passive recipients, but active negotiators of in mentoring relationships, so they can actually participate in power dynamics. It also showed that that it will be useful for them and for mentors to have a kind of awareness of positioning processes and frames, that students know that they can do power themselves, but they can also be enabled to do power by the mentors, and by explaining or speaking out to those frames, they can try to align those frames so they're going in the same direction. It also seems that if there is a mismatch in frames, it is connected with a dissatisfaction of students. For example, with imposed power, the example of him doing home visits, but actually don't want to do home visits. And it also raises the question, if the frames align, is it then desirable for learning? And then next, these findings can also show that power can be more than an hierarchical institutional power and the power imbalance between mentor and student. But it can also be a kind of flux. And we hope that the integration of positioning theory and frame analysis can help to analyze those more dynamical way of seeing power. And it also shows that the tactics that students use, as well as the multimodalities, as discussed before, are very important to understand those power dynamics, because looking at your phone, it's not verbal language, but is telling a lot about power. So this was a bit our story of using positioning theory together with frame analysis to uncover power of students. I'm very looking forward to hearing your thoughts about it.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, which nicely articulates an example of how to explore power in a particular context. So I think builds on some of the things that Katarina and I were talking about earlier. It's always interesting to see how these talks align. We don't necessarily group things together by topic. It's kind of whatever dates fit for people. At this time, I'd like to invite people to ask questions or make comments. You can do this in a couple of different ways. We're a pretty small group today, so if you want to just unmute and put yourself on screen to ask a question or make a comment, that might be the easiest way to do it. But if you want to, you can also put a comment in the chat if that makes you more comfortable. So at this time, I'm going to see if there are questions or comments for the presenters or for the group. So we also engage in cross conversation here. I see Omar is asking if we have access to Hannelore's slides. We will post the presentations to YouTube, so you'll be able to see the visual representations to those. And so you will have access to that visual presentation. Oh, go ahead, Daniel. I see your hand is up. If I miss your hand being up, please feel free to help point that out. We want to make sure people get a chance to talk. Go ahead.
Thank you, Hannelore, for the presentation. It's really nice to see how you organize the data, how you share the data. I had a question about the resistance. I'm not sure if I followed, because you had the first example was the resistance with the student looking at his or her cell phone during the consultation, and you interpreted it as a resistance towards, and you had you also had an example of the interview that this is not doing these home visits. They aren't so fruitful, or if I understood it correctly. Do you have any more arguments for that interpretation? Because standing with a cell phone could be, I mean, if you have this multimodal view, I mean, if the mentor was turning his or her back to the student, or if they were just not talking to her, or if the student was just bored, how can we? What is it in what is the resistance? What is it? What is in the word resistance there, and how do you come up with that? Do I make myself clear, Hannelore? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think this one example is just like one quote of what I saw a lot of times happening during the internship, that when he lost his interest, and those moments were always during home visits or during the car ride towards a home visit that he took his phone. And I think I don't think he's really aware of the doing power. It was noticeable because also the mentor was telling to me like, oh, he's spending so much time on his phone, that I felt that the student was doing power, because it had an effect on the mentor. Why it is resistance? Because I think he is trying to resist the situation where he's in. Like doing a lot of home visits, he wants to stop it, or I think in a way subtly show that he doesn't want to do it. So that's why it's called resistance. I don't know if it's more clear for you now.
Yeah, I think so. I'm just curious how you, because there's something happening there. It's not a speech act. It's something they do, and I don't know the age of these people, but you know, if you count in some sort of cultural and social context, some of the younger students that I have are like, you know, to pick up the cell phone is not as it's not interpreted not being respectful. It's just you know, it's like a teddy bear nowadays. You know, it's nothing. There's intention when you have that resistance. There's intention that I'm doing this because, and I'm just, you know, how to interpret those acts. I understand what you're saying, and I probably would come to the same conclusion, but I think it's quite a big word, and how do we actually know? Could it enough to be describe it instead of actually doing something? Yeah, I'll stop there, but it's just interesting.
Yeah, but your comment is very interesting because for me, it also raises the question if doing power is always intentional. Maybe he just picks up his phone because he wants to check his Instagram, for example. But still, it has an effect on the mentor because as the excerpt of the imposed power also shows, he's like, oh, do you want to lead the next home visit? So you see that something is happening in that mentoring relationship. So maybe even if it's not intentional, there's still something happening, and maybe, yeah, it depends on the definition of power, of what power. Maybe it's not a strong way of doing power.
But when picking up the phone is of course an act that leads to something, but the intention behind the act could be discussed. I mean, it could be like, I have a sick mother, I need to check if whatever. But the act is a act of power, but the resistance is someone behind it doing that for a certain. Yeah. It's just separating the subject with the actual the act. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I can leave it there to let other people in, but
I think. Oh, Daniel, just to pick up on that, I think that one of the questions that Carissa has asked in the chat, and then there are some other folks who've made comments too, which we can ask them to revoice in a minute if they want to, or we can read them from the chat. But Carissa's question was, do you have experience with doing member checks to have participants comment on your interpretation? So I think that speaks to Daniel's point about, well, how, you know, is the person, you know, why were they doing this? So is that something our participant check, something that you included in this study? Do you have that aspect as part of the data?
I did it, but very like briefly. So during the second and the third interview, the first part of the interview is always discuss those kind of situations, and then build further on their interpretation, what they felt, what was happening, what they thought that the other person was feeling, or what effect could it have been, or so we had a bit of member checking, but not after the full analysis. So there was, during the data collection, there was analysis going on, but not after like the whole process of the types of power. We didn't check again.
And so it sounds like Sonia has also asked a question too about the possibility of seeing the study afterwards. So it sounds like that maybe that was that shared with them, or do they have access to that?
Not yet.
Not-
The study is just submitted. So I was planning to wait for reaction first and then send it to the participants. Yeah.
And then so I guess stand by for what the reaction will be, Sonia, to your question. And then Katarina, you posted a question about the student being on their phone, and is this permissible? I don't know if you want to re-explain that a little
Yeah,
bit.
I'll try to explain it. So when I was initially listening to this example, I was thinking like, there might be reasons for the person to be on their phone that aren't like, I mean, if you know that the person went onto their Instagram, that's different. But like, I guess my question was, would there be reasons for this student to be on their phone related to the work they're doing, like consulting a text of some kind, or notes, that sort of thing? Because in that case, would that still be resistance, like just the act of I'm sorry, just the act of taking out the phone while in that mentoring conversation? Or would it really depend on what the student is looking at, or how would you analyze that?
I think it would definitely depend on what the student is doing. Indeed, if he's taking notes to learn what they talk about, or to remember what they talk about, I think that's the totally different intention, but because the frame is different, I think, of the student. But then still, for the effect on the mentor, the mentor doesn't know what he is doing, and he discussed it a lot of times in their interviews, that he was really getting annoyed by the amount of taking the phone of the student. So I think it will probably still be a kind of power, but maybe a different meaning of power. And I think it's a nice way. This discussion is a nice way that shows how every situation or every act or positioning can have a different meaning in a different, with very small details or different details.
It also strikes me that like that word that you used in one part of your presentation was flux, that notion that power isn't hierarchical. I mean, I think we tend to think of the power as hierarchies, and sometimes we also get, I know in English, trapped in these the language that we're in with these binaries, like you have power or you don't have power, and then there's certain very linear approach. But I think that notion of flux introduces the fluidities of power, and that, as you said, like you could have the exact same event with the explanations that are given, like, yes, there's a legitimate reason to be on my phone because I'm checking on, my child who's ill, or my, whatever it is, or I'm consulting a textbook. But that doesn't change the fact that that if there's this constant interaction with, say, a phone or some other thing, that the mentor is reading that another way, right? So I think that notion of, I mean, what's interesting about the work is the ways that you're trying to go beyond those linear and binary approaches to really explore this in different directions. I think that that provides a potential real helpful example of how this work can be applied in context to further elaborate, I guess, that, because one of the frequent questions I think that people have had across the positioning theory work is like, well, what does it mean? Lots of folks have said this I know I've said this in my own work, is like that positioning theory is useful because it helps draw our attention to ways to think about power, right? But then the other part of it is, where are there really good examples of how to do that, like on the research side, like as an analyst, how do I look at this? And it seems like that's one of the ways that you're making a contribution, is helping to think about those ways to do the analysis and then write about it. So I appreciate that. Grace, I see you've just turned on your video. I don't know if that means you have a question or a comment that you want to ask him.
I wanted to take it further. The student, by going on the phone, is actually going into another context and going into a multimodal space. So arguably, one could analyze that multimodally. Is it related? It takes us back to the first study. Is it related to what the student is studying in relation to the home visit or wherever they're going, or is it something that's completely different? But as far as supporting the argument of resistance, they are, in a sense, at least attentionally leaving that context. Just my 2 cents worth. It was interesting. I was looking back through the multimodal notes, and that is a means. I've looked at how people inhabit spaces with their positioning, and this is a way of taking it elsewhere. Just a comment. It's not.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, I think there are also multiple storylines unfolding at the same time. Then.
Yes.
And isn't it also the mobile phone in itself, it's very filled with, or loaded, how do you say in English, with values. I mean, in Sweden, this is a big thing among teachers, this cell phone. If we pick up a piece of paper to start reading or start reading on some sort of information board would be, but the cell phone in itself, it doesn't matter if it's a PDF with a lot of facts, just the cell phone itself is problematic. It's just,
I think
it would be seen as very disrespectful towards the person they visit and so on. But to analyze, because the whole situation, sorry, Hannelore, I don't remember how much you explained, but since it's not roles, it's positions. I mean, when the supervisor asks this person to visit, that one comes in charge, and then the students pick up the phone, something happens, but it will be the fluidity could be also, it might not just be the resistance in that situation. But yeah, I know it's just a short presentation you have to pick, but it could be interesting to see the whole, what's happening in 5 minutes there.
It strikes me that that one of the interesting things I'm thinking about Katarina's discussion of the positioning analysis through an artifact, and how a lot of the technology related work is like people, and then there's technology, but it'd actually be interesting to do a study of positioning following the artifact as the phone, right? And using it as the focal point in some context, especially given how phones are perceived in relation to educational settings, because despite the fact that they're almost an appendage now, they're not, it's like for a lot of folks, it's like your third hand, right? It's not really seen as a separate thing. It's seen as an extension of the self. But if that artifact was used, that might be another interesting positioning study that could be done. That's on it.
Well, no, and I was thinking something similar, Mary. We must have been on the same brainwave, because as that started happening, I was like, oh, well, based on what Grace had mentioned, I'm like, oh yeah, you could do an artifact, like that kind of similar analysis where you're just kind of, if you could, and like maybe tapping into, or doing like a, hey, seeing if your participant could also then recall, like, oh, what were you using your phone for? Just to because then it really opens it up even more, because you really see how that artifact and all that it can do impacts the situation. The other thing, Mary, that your comment made me think about is that I know around here, some schools are moving to having very limited cell phone usage in schools. There's something called a yonder pouch, where kids will put their cell phone in. There's one school that's been doing it since September, and their disciplinary reports have gone down substantially because they found that a lot of bullying happens online and then comes into school. And so it's really interesting. I mean, that's obviously that's anecdotal. It hasn't actually been researched yet, but like, I do wonder about what that could look like in schools in the future, where maybe there's a little bit less usage of it because they're noticing all of the ill effects of it. So just my 2 cents.
That's a really interesting, observation, even though it hasn't been instantiated in data. We've seen those movements. I don't know if this is happening in other countries to a large extent as well, but in the US, there have been a lot of districts that have started, schools that have started instituting these cell phone bans or limited usage in some ways. Other comments? We have just a couple of minutes. Any final comments or questions? I think in that case, we'll leave things here. Thank you so much to our presenters today and for all of you for joining us. And we'll look forward to seeing you next month for 2 different sets of talks in February, which I think again are very timely. So really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day or a wonderful evening.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.